A ghost haunts Europe. The ghost of communism. All the forces of old Europe united for the sacred persecution of this ghost. The Pope and the Tsar, the Maitre d'Guizot, French radicals and German policemen. Is there an opposition party somewhere that its opponents standing in power would not have denounced as communist? Where is the opposition party, which in turn would not throw a stigmatizing accusation of communism, both to the more advanced representatives of the opposition and to its reactionary opponent? Two conclusions follow from this fact. Communism is already recognized as a force by all European forces. It is time for the communists to openly state their views, their goals, their aspirations in front of the whole world, and to oppose the manifesto of the party itself to the fairy tales about the ghost of communism. The history of all hitherto existing societies has been the history of class struggle. The free and the slave, the patrician plebeian, the serf landowner, the master and the apprentices. In short, the oppressor and the oppressed were in eternal antagonism to each other, waged a continuous, now hidden, now overt struggle, always ending in the revolutionary reorganization of the entire social edifice or the general destruction of the struggling classes. In the preceding historical epoch, we find almost everywhere a complete division of society into various estates, a whole ladder of different social positions. In ancient Rome, we meet patricians, horsemen, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, apprentices, serfs. And besides, almost every one of these classes has special gradations. Emerging from the depths of the lost feudal society, modern bourgeois society has not destroyed class contradictions. It has only put new classes, new conditions of oppression, and new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, differs, however, in that it simplified class contradictions. Society is splitting more and more into two large hostile camps, into two large classes facing each other, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. From the serfs of the Middle Ages came the free population of the first cities. The first elements of the bourgeoisie also divorced from this class of citizens. The discovery of America and the sea route around Africa created a new field of activity for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, the exchange with the colonies, the increase in the number of means of exchange and goods in general gave a hitherto unheard of impetus to trade, navigation, and industry, and thereby caused the rapid development of a revolutionary element in the disintegrating feudal society. The former feudal or guild organization of industry could no longer satisfy the demand that increased with the new markets. The manufactory took its place. The guild masters were displaced by the industrial middle class. The division of labor between different corporations has disappeared, giving way to the division of labor within a separate workshop. But the markets were growing, the demand was increasing, and the manufactory could no longer satisfy it. Then the steam machine revolutionized the industry. The place of manufacture was taken by modern large-scale industry. The place of the industrial middle class was taken by millionaire industrialists, leaders of entire industrial armies, modern bourgeois. Large-scale industry has created a worldwide market, prepared by the discovery of America. The world market has caused a tremendous development of trade, navigation, and means of land communication. And to the same extent that industry, trade, navigation, railways grew, the bourgeoisie developed. It increased its capital and pushed into the background all the classes inherited from the Middle Ages. We see, therefore, that the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long process of development, a series of revolutions in the mode of production and exchange. The bourgeoisie has played an extremely revolutionary role in history. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has achieved dominance, has destroyed all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. Mercilessly she tore the motley feudal bonds that bound man to his natural overlords, and left no other connection between people except the naked interest of a heartless Chistagan. In the icy water of egoistic calculation, she drowned the sacred thrill of religious ecstasy, chivalrous enthusiasm, petty bourgeois sentimentality. It has turned a person's personal dignity into an exchange value and has replaced countless granted and acquired freedoms with one unscrupulous freedom of trade. In a word, it replaced the exploitation covered by religious and political illusions with open, shameless, direct and callous exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped the sacred halo of all kinds of activities that have hitherto been considered honorable and looked at with awe. She turned a doctor, a lawyer, a priest, a poet, a man of science into her paid employees. The bourgeoisie tore off their pathetically sentimental veil from family relations and reduced them to purely monetary relations. The bourgeoisie has shown that the crude manifestation of force in the Middle Ages, which arouses such admiration among our reactionaries, found a natural complement in laziness and immobility. She showed for the first time what human activity can achieve. She created wonders of art, but of a completely different kind than the Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, or Gothic cathedrals. She made quite different campaigns than the migration of peoples or the Crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly causing revolutions in the instruments of production, and consequently revolutionizing the relations of production, and therefore the whole totality of social relations. The need for ever-increasing sales of products drives the bourgeoisie around the globe. It has to infiltrate everywhere, settle down everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie, by exploiting the world market, has made the production and consumption of all countries cosmopolitan. To the great chagrin of the reactionaries, it tore the national soil from under the feet of industry. The original national industries have been destroyed and continue to be destroyed every day. They are being displaced by new industries, the introduction of which becomes a matter of life for all civilized nations. Industries that process no longer local raw materials, but raw materials imported from the most remote regions of the globe, and produce factory products consumed in all parts of the world. Instead of the old needs that were satisfied with domestic products, new ones arise, which require products from the most remote countries and the most diverse climates to meet. The old local and national isolation is being replaced by a comprehensive connection and comprehensive dependence of nations on each other. This applies equally to both material and spiritual production. The fruits of the spiritual activity of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness are becoming more and more impossible. And from the multitude of national and local literatures or music, one world literature or world music or world culture is formed. On pain of death, it forces all nations to adopt the bourgeois mode of production, forces them to introduce the so-called civilization, that is, to become bourgeois. The bourgeoisie subordinated the countryside to the domination of the city. It created huge cities, increased the urban population to a high degree compared to the rural population, and thus pulled a significant part of the population out of the idiocy of village life. Just as it has made the countryside dependent on the city, so it has made barbaric and semi-barbaric countries dependent on civilized countries, peasant peoples on bourgeois peoples, the East on the West. The bourgeoisie is destroying more and more the fragmentation of the means of production, property, and population. It condensed the population, centralized the means of production, concentrated property in the hands of a few. A necessary consequence of this was political centralization. Independent regions connected almost exclusively by union relations with various interests, laws, governments, and customs duties turned out to be united into one nation with one government, one legislation, one national class interest, one customs border. During the 200 years of its class domination, the bourgeoisie has created more numerous and more grandiose productive forces than all previous generations combined. The conquest of the forces of nature, machine production, the use of chemistry in industry and agriculture, which of the previous centuries could have suspected that such productive forces were dormant in the depths of social labor. So we have seen that the means of production and exchange, on the basis of which the bourgeoisie was formed, were created in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of these means of production and exchange, the relations in which the production and exchange of feudal society took place, the feudal organization of agriculture and industry, in a word, the feudal property relations, have already ceased to correspond to the developed productive forces. They slowed down production instead of developing it. They became his fetters. They had to be broken up, and they were smashed. A similar movement is taking place before our eyes. Modern bourgeois society is like a magician who is no longer able to cope with the underground forces caused by his spells. For several decades now, the history of industry and trade has been nothing but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern relations of production, against those relations of property that are a condition for the existence of the bourgeoisie and the rule of the bourgeoisie. It is enough to point out the trade crises, which, returning from time to time, more and more menacingly call into question the existence of the entire bourgeois society. During trade crises, a significant part of not only manufactured products, but even the already created productive forces, is destroyed every time. During crises, a social epidemic is irritated, which would have seemed absurd to all previous epochs. The epidemic of overproduction. Society is suddenly thrown back to a state of sudden barbarism, as if famine, a general devastating war, deprived it of all means of life. It seems that industry and trade have been destroyed. And why? Because society has too much civilization, has too many means of living, has too much industry and trade. In what way does the bourgeoisie overcome the crisis? On the one hand, by the forced destruction of a whole mass of productive forces. On the other hand, by conquering new markets and exploiting the old ones more thoroughly. By the fact that it prepares more comprehensive and more crushing crises and reduces the means of countering them. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie overthrew feudalism are now being directed against the bourgeoisie itself. But the bourgeoisie has not only forged weapons that bring death to it, it has also given birth to people who will use these weapons against it. Modern workers, proletarians. To the same extent that the bourgeoisie, i.e. capital, develops, the proletariat also develops. A class of modern workers who can exist only when they find work, and find it only as long as their labor increases capital. These workers are forced to sell themselves piece by piece, are the same commodity as any other object of trade, and therefore are equally subject to all the accidents of competition, all the fluctuations of the market. As a result of the increasing use of the division of labor machine, the labor of the proletarians has lost all independent character, and at the same time, all attractiveness for the worker. The worker becomes a simple appendage of the machine. Only the simplest, most monotonous, most easily assimilated techniques are required of him. The costs of the worker are therefore reduced almost exclusively to the means of subsistence necessary for his maintenance and the continuation of his kind. The masses of workers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As ordinary industrial armies, they are placed under the supervision of a whole hierarchy of non-commissioned officers and officers. They are slaves not only of the bourgeois class. Every day and every hour, they are enslaved by the machine, the overseer, and above all, the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. This despotism is the more petty, the more hateful, and the more it hardens, the more its goal is proclaimed to be profit. The less art and strength manual labor requires, that is, the more modern industry develops, the more men's labor is replaced by women's and children's. In relation to the working class, the distinction between sex and age loses all social significance. From now on, there are only working tools that require different costs depending on age and gender. When the exploitation of the factory worker ends, and the worker finally receives his wages in cash, other parts of the bourgeoisie attack him: the landlord, the shopkeeper, the usurer. The lower strata of the middle class, small industrialists, small traders and rentiers, artisans and peasants, all these classes are falling into the ranks of the proletariat, partly because their small capital is not enough to run large industrial enterprises, and it does not stand up to competition with larger capitalists, and partly because their professional skills are devalued as a result of the introduction of new methods of production. This is how the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. The proletariat goes through various stages of development. His struggle against the bourgeoisie begins with his existence. First, the struggle is waged by individual workers, then workers of one factory, then workers of one industry in one locality, against a separate bourgeoisie, which directly exploits them. At this stage, the workers form a mass scattered throughout the country and fragmented by competition. But with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in numbers, it accumulates in large masses. Its strength grows, and it feels it more and more. The interests and living conditions of the proletariat are becoming more and more equalized, as machines increasingly erase the differences between individual types of labor and almost everywhere do not reduce wages to an equally low level. The increasing competition of the bourgeoisie among themselves and the trade crises caused by it lead to the fact that workers' wages are becoming increasingly unstable. The ever-rapidly developing continuous improvement of machines makes the living situation of the proletarians less and less secure. The clashes between the individual worker and the individual bourgeois are increasingly taking on the character of clashes between two classes. The workers begin by forming coalitions against the bourgeoisie. They act together to protect their wages. They even establish permanent associations in order to provide themselves with funds in case of possible collisions. In places, the struggle turns into open uprisings. Workers win from time to time, but these victories are only coming. The real result of their struggle is not immediate success, but an ever-spreading union of workers. It is promoted by the ever-growing means of communication created by large-scale industry and establishing communication between workers of different localities. Only this connection is required in order to centralize many local centers of struggle, which are of the same character everywhere, and merge them into one national class struggle. And every class struggle is a political struggle, and the unification, for which medieval townspeople with their country roads took centuries, is achieved by modern proletarians in a few years. In those periods when the class struggle is nearing its denouement, the process of decomposition within the ruling class, within the entire old society, takes on such a violent, such a sharp character that a small part of the ruling class renounces it and joins the revolutionary class, the class to which the future belongs. That is why, just as before a part of the nobility passed to the bourgeoisie, now a part of the bourgeoisie necessarily passes to the proletariat. It is part of the bourgeois ideologues who have risen to a theoretical understanding of the entire course of the historical movement. Of all the classes that are now opposed to the bourgeoisie, only the proletariat represents a truly revolutionary class. All other classes decline and are destroyed with the development of large-scale industry. The proletariat is its own product. Middle class, small industrialist, small trader, artisan, peasant, all of them are fighting the bourgeoisie in order to save their existence from destruction as the middle classes. They are therefore not revolutionary, they are conservative. Even more, they are reactionary. They seek to turn the wheel of history back. The lumpen proletariat is a passive product of the rotting of the lowest strata of the old society, sometimes involved in the movement of the proletarian revolution, but, because of his position in life, he is much more inclined to sell himself for reactionary machinations. The living conditions of the old society have already been destroyed in the living conditions of the proletariat. The proletarian has no property. His attitude towards his wife and children has nothing more in common with bourgeois family relations. Modern industrial labor, the modern yoke of capital, the same both in England and in France, both in America and in Germany, have erased from it all national character. Laws, morals, religion, all this for him is nothing more than bourgeois prejudices, behind which bourgeois interests are hidden. All the former classes, having gained dominance for themselves, sought to consolidate the positions they had already acquired in life, subjecting the whole society to conditions that ensured their method of appropriation. The proletarians, on the other hand, can conquer the social productive forces only by destroying their own current mode of appropriation, and thereby the entire hitherto existing mode of appropriation as a whole. The proletarians have nothing of their own that they need to protect. They must destroy everything that has so far protected and secured private property. All the movements that have taken place so far have been movements of a minority, or committed in the interests of a minority. The proletarian movement, on the other hand, is an independent movement of the vast majority, in the interests of the vast majority. The proletariat, this lowest stratum of modern society, cannot rise, cannot straighten itself up, without the whole superstructure of the strata that form official society rising above it, being blown up into the air. If not in content, then in form, the struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle. The proletariat of each country, of course, must first do away with its own bourgeoisie. In describing the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we have traced a more or less veiled civil war within the existing society, up to the point when it turns into an open revolution, and the proletariat establishes its rule through the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie. All previously non-existent societies were based, as we have seen, on the antagonism between the oppressive and oppressed classes. The worker becomes a pauper, a beggar, and pauperism grows even faster than population and wealth. This clearly shows that the bourgeoisie is unable to remain the dominant class of society and imposes on the whole society the conditions of existence of its class as a regulating law. The bourgeoisie is not able to dominate because it is not able to provide its slave with even a servile level of existence, because it is forced to let him sink to a position where it itself must feed him, instead of feeding at his expense. Society can no longer live under her rule, that is, her life is no longer compatible with society. The main condition for the existence and domination of the bourgeois class is the accumulation of wealth in the hands of private individuals, education and capital increase. The condition for the existence of capital is wage labor. Wage labor rests solely on the competition of workers among themselves. The progress of industry, of which the bourgeoisie is the involuntary bearer, is powerless to resist it. Puts in place of the separation of workers' competitions, the revolutionary association of workers through associations. Thus, with the development of large-scale industry, the very basis on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products is torn out from under the feet of the bourgeoisie. It produces, first of all, its own gravediggers. Its demise and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. In what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians in general? The communists are not a special party opposed to other workers' parties. They have no interests separate from the interests of the entire proletariat as a whole. They do not set out any special principles under which they would like to fit the proletarian movement. Communists differ from other proletarian parties only in that, on the one hand, in the struggle of the proletarians of various nations, they single out and defend the common interests of the entire proletariat, independent of nationality. On the other hand, the fact that at various stages of development, through which the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie passes, they are always representatives of the interests of the movement as a whole. The immediate goal of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: the formation of the proletariat class, the overthrow of the rule of the bourgeoisie, the conquest of political power by the proletariat. The theoretical positions of the communists are in no way based on ideas, principles invented or discovered by one or another renovator of the world. They are only a general expression of the actual relations of the ongoing class struggle, an expression of the historical movement taking place before our eyes. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property in general, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the last and most complete expression of such production and appropriation of products, which rests on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of some by others. And it is in this sense that communists can express their theory in one provision: destruction of private property, private bourgeois property. We communists were reproached for wanting to destroy property obtained by personal labor, property which forms the basis of all personal freedom, activity and independence, earned, acquired property. But does wage labor, the labor of the proletarian, create his property? No, oui. He creates capital, that is, property, exploiting wage labor. Property, which can only increase if it generates new wage labor in order to exploit it again. To be a capitalist means to occupy not only a personal, but also a social position in production. Capital is a collective product and can be put into motion only by the joint activity of many members of society, and ultimately only by the joint activity of all members of society. So, capital, this is not a personal, but a public and only a public force. Consequently, if capital is transformed into collective property belonging to all members of society, it will not be the transformation of personal property into public property. The average price of wage labor is the minimum wage, that is, the sum of the means of subsistence necessary to preserve the life of the worker as a worker. Consequently, what the wage earner appropriates as a result of his activity is barely enough to reproduce his life. We do not intend at all to destroy this personal appropriation of the products of labor that serve directly for the reproduction of life. We only want to destroy the pathetic nature of such appropriation when the worker lives only to increase someone else's capital, and capital in general, and lives only insofar as the interests of the ruling class demand it. In bourgeois society, living labor is only a means to increase accumulated labor. In a communist society, accumulated labor, these are just means to expand, enrich, and facilitate the life process of workers. Thus, in bourgeois society, the past dominates the present. In a communist society, the present dominates the past. In bourgeois society, capital has independence and individuality, while the working individual is deprived of independence and impersonal. And the bourgeoisie calls the destruction of these relations the abolition of personality and freedom. It is right, indeed. We are talking about the abolition of bourgeois personality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom. Freedom within the framework of the current bourgeois industrial relations is understood as freedom of trade, freedom of purchase and sale. You are horrified that we want to destroy private property. But in your current society, private property has been destroyed for 9/10 of its members. You accuse us, therefore, of wanting to destroy property, which presupposes as a necessary condition the absence of property in the vast majority of society. In a word, you accuse us of wanting to destroy your property. Yes, we really want to do it. Objections were raised that with the destruction of private property, all activity would cease and universal laziness would reign. Why the hell were the flowers removed from the grounds? Why electricity? God grant memory. It has been rotten for 20 years twice. At the present time, it is carefully extinguished twice a day. In this case, bourgeois society should have perished long ago from laziness, because here the one who works does not gain anything, and the one who gains does not work. All objections directed against the communist method of appropriation and production of material products also apply to the appropriation of the production of intellectual labor products, just as the destruction of class property appears to the bourgeois as the destruction of production itself. So the destruction of class education for him is equivalent to the destruction of education in general. But after all, education, the death of which he laments, is for the vast majority a transformation into an appendage of the machine. Your ideas are the product of bourgeois industrial relations and bourgeois property relations. Just as your right is only the will of your class raised into law, or the destruction of the family. Even the most extreme radicals are outraged by this vile intention of the communists. But let's think about what the modern bourgeois family is based on capital, on private gain. In a completely developed form, it exists only for the bourgeoisie, but it finds its complement forced without the family of the proletarians and in public prostitution.
I wouldn't want to sleep with you, even though I didn't stay. I wouldn't want to be with you.
Of course, in general, you need a woman who is a little vicious internally, and a young and vicious one is still better than an elderly and vicious one. Because to imagine a woman next to you who agrees to a lot for the sake of money, you understand that it can't be any other way. The bourgeois family naturally disappears with the disappearance of this complement of it, and both will disappear together with the disappearance of capital. Or you blame us for wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents. We confess to this crime. But you claim that it replaces home education with public education. We want to destroy the most expensive relationships for a person. Isn't your upbringing determined by society? Isn't it determined by the social relations in which you are brought up? It is not determined by direct or indirect intervention, society through school and so on. Communists do not invent the influence of society on education. They only change the nature of education, tear it out from under the influence of the ruling class. Then no one, you know, Vanya, no one, even the smallest one, will dare to offend. Bourgeois rants about family and upbringing, about the tender relationship between parents and children, inspire the more disgust. The more all family ties are destroyed among the proletariat, thanks to the development of large-scale industry, the more children turn into simple objects of trade and into working tools. But you are also communists. You want to introduce a community of wives. The whole bourgeoisie is shouting at us in chorus. The bourgeois looks at his wife as a simple tool of production. He hears that the instrument of production is supposed to be provided for general use, and of course, he cannot get rid of the idea that women will suffer the same fate. He, of course, does not even suspect that we are talking about eliminating the position of a woman when she is a simple tool of production.
And how many people do you have under your command?
POC, 2000.
Father, how are you coping with him? It's hard, isn't it?
It's hard with 3. When you learn to organize 3, then the number does not matter. However, there is nothing funnier than the moral horror of our bourgeoisie about the alleged official community of communist wives. Communists do not need to introduce a community of wives. It has almost always existed. Our bourgeoisie, dissatisfied with the fact that they have the wives and daughters of their workers at their disposal, not to mention official prostitution, see a special pleasure in seducing each other's wives. Not communist, but bourgeois marriage is in fact a community of wives. It's already 3 o'clock in the morning. Until you pay me $300, nothing will happen. But it goes without saying that with the destruction of the current industrial relations, the community of wives resulting from them, that is, official and unofficial prostitution, will disappear. Then the communists are reproached as if they want to abolish the fatherland, to abolish nationality. The workers have no fatherland. You can't take away from them what they don't have. The national separateness and opposites of peoples are already disappearing more and more with the development of the bourgeoisie, with freedom of trade, with the world market, with the uniformity of industrial production, and the corresponding living conditions. The domination of the proletariat will further accelerate their disappearance, to the same extent that the exploitation of one individual by another will be destroyed, the exploitation of one nation by another will be destroyed. Along with the antagonism of classes within the nation's hostile relations with each other will also fall. Let us leave aside, however, the objections of the bourgeoisie against communism. We have already seen above that the first step in the workers' revolution is the transformation of the proletariat into the ruling classes, the conquest of democracy. The proletariat uses its political domination to wrest all capital from the bourgeoisie step by step, to centralize all the instruments of production in the hands of the state, that is, the proletariat, organized as the ruling class, and perhaps to increase the sum of productive forces faster. Of course, this can happen at first only with the help of despotic interference in property rights and in bourgeois relations of production, that is, with the help of measures that economically seem insufficient and untenable, which in the course of the movement outgrow themselves, and are inevitable as means for a revolution in the entire mode of production. These measures will, of course, vary from country to country, but the following measures can be applied almost universally in the most advanced countries. Expropriation of land property and conversion of land rents to cover public expenditures, a high progressive tax, the abolition of the right of inheritance, the confiscation of the property of all immigrants and all rebels, centralization of credit in the hands of the state through a national bank with state capital and with an exclusive monopoly, centralization of all transport in the hands of the state, an increase in the number of state-owned factories, production tools, clearing for the tower, and improving the land according to the general plan, the same obligation of labor for all institutions of industrial armies, especially for agriculture, combining agriculture with industry, promoting the gradual elimination of the distinction between town and country, public and free education of all children, elimination of factory labor of children in its modern form, combining education with material production. In place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class opposites comes an association in which the free development of everyone is a condition for the free development of all. Communists consider it a despicable thing to hide their views and intentions. They openly declare that their goals can be achieved only through the violent non-overthrow of the entire existing social order. Let the ruling classes shudder before the communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose in it, except their own chains. They will gain the whole world. Proletarians of all countries, unite.